This lesson for our Cornet project class is titled How the Lexical Support Standard Achieves a Humility in Hermeneutics. This is the seminary standard of excellence. If you had attended the seminary, the one I attended, oldest Bible school in the state of Arkansas, 90 years old now, and you had been in a class and you were working on, let's say, a paper where you did your own research, or perhaps you had advanced in a class from the grammar to the lexical-syntactical analysis, then you would be required to show lexical support. What that does is it tethers you to the text. It also drives you backwards. That is, you go back to the languages, Hebrew and Greek, Koine Greek, even the Koine Greek Old Testament. Sometimes people will mention Aramaic, but it's not often that you will spend time with that since it is such a small portion of the Old Testament. So let's move forward and just see an example. A historical development of biblical lexicons. Leading biblical lexicons have emerged over centuries. This is from BibleHub.com. They're shaped by new manuscript discoveries and refined linguistics. For Hebrew, works such as Ludwig, Köhler, and Walter Baumgartner's lexicons grew as new epigraphic and archaeological research surfaced. Of course, the BDAG, I've referenced it before. I always called it Bauer's Greek English lexicon. There's others with it. It's Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich's lexicon. And that has long been the scholarly standard. And unless I had attended the seminary, I would have never heard of it. Now, maybe later in life, when internet became popular and access to resources unlimited through Bible softwares, I would have found it then. But I was introduced to it in the seminary, just like several other things, advanced Greek encyclopedias of New Testament words and also Old Testament. Those were quite expensive then. But we were introduced to multiple tools as the seminary advertised the panoply of tools. So this is the history here. For example, Arminians and Calvinists. This is so typical and ordinary, but it is useful as we do in this class. We use this energy, this catalysis between competing constructs and those who identify accordingly. It says they've been fundamentally at odds with one another for 400 years over the doctrine of election. And here's a paper, I've referenced it more than once already, provided links to it for people online when they engage in discussion, but on the meaning from the foundation of the world in the New Testament, based on etymology and lexical-syntactical usage of base word forms in the Septuagint. And this was copyright 1997. I haven't found the updated material. I'll look for that. It's supposed to be updated in 2013. The methodology of exhaustive research seemed to be a novel concept to a great many theological practitioners. That was definitely a novel concept to me in 1986 when I first arrived at the seminary. There are no shortcuts to genuine theology. It is believed that the many appendices in this work bring to the reader a vast amount of necessary material by which he or she can make an informed decision concerning this important subject. Now, we were never encouraged to make our own decisions independent of the text. Again, being tethered to the standard of lexical support, if you want to adhere to that, it I guess affords us the abandonment of our assumptions. And why would we want to call it study if all we're doing is just confirming, that is confirmation bias, practicing confirmation bias and just looking for what we already believe. Issues of translation, the word in question, katabolo, that's the verb. This is a copy from that. It is important because it appears as part of a phrase that has been translated from the foundation of the world in 10 locations in the Greek, that is in the New Testament. The phrase in the Greek is apo or pro katabole, kosmu. Now, I could have cleaned that up, but that was a direct cut and paste. Issues of translation continue. The noun form is present in those 10 verses in the New Testament. The translation of this phrase has bearing on the validity of the proof for the concept that God lives in an eternal now. Now, something else you'll learn is those early writers among what they call church fathers wherever they originated. Many of them had consumed large volumes of Greek philosophy, so it was very difficult for them when they approached the text, as it is for anyone with pre-understanding, to not find that same philosophy, I guess, and have it influence their interpretation of the text. But it says it's been observed by else that the phrase should be translated in view of or because of the moral fall or disintegration of the inhabitants of the world order. These issues continue. If this latter translation is true, then the result would be, in effect, to remove these passages as proof text for the concept of eternal now. Now, eternal now, that has something to do with Augustine, and perhaps we will spend time studying it. But we haven't had to in the Koine Project class. We've noticed, for example, when we were trained to be expositors, we were also trained to be expositors on the one hand, while also practicing and adhering to the lexical support in practice. So we might say we go through line upon line and text by text and stay in a book, for example, as I've done for years before. And yet, while we're doing that, we also would stop and adhere to lexical support. We'd break the words down according to etymology, basic things, by the way. So it will probably surprise no one that this interpretation has caused considerable reaction, not all of which is consistent with Christian civility and candor, which you all know the difference between when you go on social media. It's not an academic environment or arena in which people have invested in their beliefs and the things they adamantly assert. And that's fine. That's good for all of us to have dialogue and discuss. I enjoy it only because I have such a vast experience with engaging people under some of the most worst conditions in their lives, when they're emoting the most severely, or when they are going through such a range of emotion, that even in, let's say, reactions that are not consistent with Christian civility and candor, it's quite a tamped down version of that with which I am directly and immediately experienced over decades now. But this reaction is simply because pre-understanding, if you're not careful in your assumptions, you might find yourself reacting when you didn't even decide to do so. Issues of translation continued very early on in Christian history. A significant scholastic voice was raised for the improper translation of the word katabole. Origen, in AD 240, complained that the word katabole had been improperly translated into Latin as creation or made. Now, we noticed that in this class, and of course we noticed it in the seminary. We went through the book of Ephesians. We took an entire year, first semester, translation, grammar, conjugate the verbs, decline the nouns, place everything in its proper position in relationship to the sentence. And then the next semester, spring semester, we spend the entirety of it developing a lexical-syntactical analysis. So you can certainly be assured that we dealt with this term katabole. And then, of course, as we learned in this class, when you start working with the word yourself individually, using the lexicon and lexical support, and you notice the distinction between the word katabole and creation, quite a difference. Then you'll find it's like the tip of the iceberg. You'll find all the way back to Origen 240. Someone had recently made a comment that I don't know how to say it. It was some have an aversion for quoting church fathers. We certainly were trained not to equate them with the authority of Scripture, so that's not a problem for us. But we didn't have to go to the church fathers first. We could study the text ourselves, and then as we were practitioners, became practitioners, we would notice the same, let's say, indicators in translations and in word meanings, and that was determined by the lexicography that we were taught to practice. So had been improperly translated. So that's Origen all the way back to the early 3rd century. This point indeed is not to be idly passed by, that the Holy Scriptures have called the creation of the world, this is Origen speaking, by a new and peculiar name, terminate katabole, which has been very improperly translated into Latin constitution, for in Greek katabole signifies rather I suppose that's a Latin word, which is to cast downwards. Obviously, it is the kata is down, boles cast. That's self-evident. You don't have to be that astute to notice how self-evident that is. A word which has been, as we have already remarked, improperly translated into Latin by the phrase to cast downwards. So let's move on. This is the final issue. The grammatical evidence of improper translation was apparent even to 3rd century Christians during the important period when the Greek texts were being translated into Latin. This has influenced successive generations of translators down to the first edition of the English Bible. Now, apparently this was something here that I really don't have interest in, but it says that Origen once believed in the pre-existence of souls, and that's a totally different thing. But it says, even though none in this day will agree with Origen concerning his belief in the pre-existence of souls, the validity of the claim for mistranslation still remains, as else, if that's how I pronounce it. And this paper's exhaustive listings of definitions will clearly show. So when you research this, it comes up often because, for example, as I've noticed in arguments, if someone's an Arminian background, they already have canned answers. Now, that's not to diminish it. It's just that they're repeating what's been repeated. And then if you come across someone who identifies as Calvinist, they already have their answers ready for what they expect or assume an Arminian might say. Dear man, very scholastic, had a hard science background, wanted to debate with me, and I did not know, with his education and hard science background, that he was not a practitioner of lexical support. So he began to import things, and he was actually, I think I could have left the room, and he was carrying on an argument that he had already assumed, quote, a typical Baptist might say. So when he would say something, I said, I don't know, I've never heard of that. I said, I was just looking at the next term in this text. Well, I was so fixated on the text that we had agreed to evaluate that it had not occurred to him initially in the banter that he was so ready to say a canned answer, prepared answer that he had worked on before he arrived, that he couldn't hear what I was saying. I would have to stop, repeat it, and ask him if he did not mind commenting on the language and the root word and basic things in lexicography. So this is what's happened when I'm involved in a conversation with whether it's someone primed according to Arminian, Calvinism, Molinism, whatever's all out there, or anything. We can all come to this. But the humility in hermeneutics is found in your willingness to approach a text assuming that you're wrong, and then approach the text with the willingness to engage the tools, and then submit to those results. But I'm not sure, thankfully I don't appreciate what caused me to enter the seminary from the outside. I was not a Baptist at the time I arrived. It was my first, I wasn't a Baptist until the next year, 1987, in a church that they would associate with in the American Baptist Association. But it was interesting because I had no idea why I would want to conserve, preserve, protect, guard something I had assumed or had only heard, because I had no value for that. But coming from a background that required great caution to prevent consequences in safety and then product liabilities when something went out on the field, you learn very quickly to devalue your assumptions and not to even participate in groupthink. But I noticed this text, seldom do I find someone prepared to discuss it. Ironically, some who are even anti-King James only, they say a lot of terrible things about them, and then they will they'll pick their translation and use the translation that they prefer, but they won't look the word up. So whether you use the King James, as we do in this class, we still look for Bible meanings for the words and try to understand what was the rationale for the translator. So you have a blessed day. Enjoy this lesson, but it's an example of how the seminary's standard of excellence, which achieves humility and hermeneutics, can be expressed technically as lexical support. So you have a blessed day and enjoy this lesson.